There's a specific psychological mechanism deep in the brain's social cognition networks that determines whether someone feels deeply connected to you or indifferent. This isn't about looks, money, or even charm. It's about how you make someone feel seen, understood, and mirrored. CIA operatives, when interrogating or manipulating targets, don't rely on force. They rely on the neuroscience of connection, on a dark yet deeply human pattern that creates intense rapport. Limbic resonance is a phenomenon rooted in the most primal layers of human neurobiology. It refers to the capacity of two nervous systems to connect and synchronize through nonverbal emotional exchange. When someone feels seen, heard, and emotionally mirrored, their brain begins to enter a state of resonance with the other person. This isn't simply about empathy in the emotional sense. It's the activation of real-time neurophysiological feedback loops that link heart rate, tone of voice, facial expressions, and pupil dilation between two individuals. The key to understanding this lies in how the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, insula, and anterior cingulate cortex, responds to subtle cues of safety, attention, and attunement. When a person perceives that someone is fully tuned into them, tracking them without judgment, their brain shifts into a state of lowered threat detection and heightened connection. Cortisol levels drop, and oxytocin and dopamine levels rise, making them feel emotionally rewarded simply by being in that person's presence. What makes this process powerful and even addictive is that it bypasses the rational brain. It operates beneath conscious awareness. You don't need to speak perfect words. You need to convey genuine presence. The CIA and elite interrogators are trained to master this. They don't begin by pushing an agenda. Instead, they start by sensing with the subject's emotional state. Matching the subject's breathing rate, their microexpressions, even the rhythm of their speech signals to the brain that the person across from them is like me, creating a mirroring effect that activates the mirror neuron system. This neurological mirroring builds a bridge for trust, attachment, and craving. And once that bridge is established, the brain begins to seek repeated interaction. In romantic or seductive contexts, this works exactly the same way. When a man is able to stay grounded, maintain soft eye contact, mirror the subtle shifts in her energy, and respond with slight nonverbal feedback, like a head nod, a slight smile, or a paced breath, he is creating a loop of limbic feedback. Her brain begins to interpret that interaction as emotionally valuable. This is not about dominance or submission, it's about attunement. And that attunement begins to generate its own reward system within the nervous system. Just being around that person starts to feel emotionally regulating and eventually emotionally necessary. The vagus nerve plays a central role in this interaction. It governs the parasympathetic response, which promotes calmness and connection. When a person's presence triggers vagal tone in another, by being calm, regulated, and responsive, it creates a neurochemical cascade that feels safe and pleasurable. This is why people who master limbic resonance are often described as magnetic or intoxicating, even when they say very little. Their emotional state regulates others. Their nervous system provides the blueprint for others to mirror. Over time, this causes the other person to associate their own feeling of emotional balance with that individual. It becomes a neurological craving, a desire not just for the person, but for the feeling of connection and resonance that only that person seems to offer. Calibrated vulnerability is the strategic disclosure of emotional truths in a way that deepens connection without overwhelming the other person's nervous system. It relies on revealing select internal experiences, not as an emotional dump, but as signals of psychological depth and self-awareness. When someone opens up in this manner, it activates the insula and anterior cingulate cortex in the listener's brain, areas tied to empathy and emotional evaluation. The key is balance. If vulnerability is too shallow, it feels inauthentic. If it's too heavy, it triggers discomfort or even withdrawal. But when it's calibrated, timed, and framed appropriately, it bypasses defenses and initiates a response of trust, curiosity, and emotional magnetism. This process is rooted in evolutionary neurobiology. Humans are wired to assess safety and predictability in others before forming close bonds. When a person shares something slightly raw, slightly imperfect, like a fear, a personal insight, or a past failure, it signals honesty and reduces perceived threat. It also activates mirror neurons in the other person's brain, making them more likely to reciprocate emotionally. The brain reads this as mutual vulnerability And the limbic system rewards that interaction with dopamine and oxytocin, creating a feeling of warmth and attachment. It's the same mechanism that forms deep friendships and romantic attachment over time, condensed into a well-paced conversational moment in CIA communication training. This principle is weaponized to build trust rapidly. The operative will often reveal a small, seemingly unplanned piece of personal information, a mild regret, a challenge they once faced, not to gain sympathy, but to drop their perceived guard. This moment of calculated exposure creates a neurobiological loop of safety in the other person. They feel less like a target, more like a confidante, and the brain reacts accordingly, lowering the amygdala's threat response and opening the door to oxytocin-fueled connection. In social or romantic scenarios, the effect is nearly identical. When a man calmly shares something like, "I used to be terrified of speaking up," or "There was a time I felt completely invisible," without seeking validation or rescue, he is communicating strength through vulnerability. This paradoxical blend is highly attractive at the neurochemical level. What makes calibrated vulnerability so powerful is that it doesn't trigger a fight or flight response. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system in the other person. This is where feelings of calm, closeness, and bonding live. When done right, the other individual begins to feel like they're not just talking to someone, they're being invited into their emotional world. And that invitation lights up the brain's reward circuitry. It's not about being dramatic or rehearsed. It's about being emotionally congruent, revealing the truth in a steady tone with eye contact and at the right moment, often following or preceding a question that shifts the spotlight back to the listener. This flow reinforces mutual connection. It primes the nervous system for emotional reciprocity, and over time it builds a craving not just for the words, but for the emotional depth that the words reveal. Voice tone and pace play a crucial role in shaping how a message is received at the neurobiological level. Long before someone evaluates the content of your words, their nervous system has already reacted to how you sound. The human brain, especially the superior temporal sulcus, is finely tuned to interpret tone, rhythm, inflection, and pauses in speech. These elements communicate emotional intent, dominance or submission, confidence or anxiety, long before language is consciously processed. When your voice is slow, steady, and slightly lower in pitch, it sends a calming signal to the listener's autonomic nervous system, reducing stress hormones like cortisol and increasing receptivity through heightened vagal tone. This is why people with a well-controlled voice are often perceived as leaders, protectors, or emotionally grounded individuals. The parasympathetic nervous system responds to vocal cues that mirror safety and regulation. A slow and warm voice tone signals emotional security, which in turn activates oxytocin pathways in the listener's brain, strengthening feelings of connection and attraction. In contrast, rapid speech or vocal tension, often caused by shallow breathing or nervousness, triggers the amygdala's threat response, creating a subtle resistance to connection. It may not even be consciously registered, but the listener's body will interpret it as a signal to retreat, guard, or disengage. CIA operatives are trained to use voice modulation to gain trust during high-stress interrogations. They never rush, they never speak with uncontrolled emotion, and they certainly never raise their voice unless it's for a calculated psychological effect. They are trained to hold silence after questions, letting the weight of the pause amplify tension in the subject's mind. That same principle is usable in everyday conversation. When a man slows his speech slightly, particularly during emotionally charged topics, and maintains a steady tone without rushing to fill silence, it tells the other person's brain that he is in control, not just of the conversation, but of his own emotional state. That's a powerful subconscious signal of stability, which many people instinctively find attractive and grounding. The pause is as important as the speech itself. When you pause, you create space for the other person's nervous system to respond. You allow them to feel the weight of your presence, and more importantly, you activate their mirror neuron system. Their body begins to entrain to your rhythm, sensing breath, tone, and pacing. This is how emotional resonance is built. The more regulated your voice, the more dysregulation you cancel in the other. Over time, this leads to them associating your voice with a felt sense of calm, safety, or even excitement, depending on how you frame the emotional environment. This is why performers, negotiators, therapists, and covert operatives spend years mastering voice training. It's not about theatrics. It's about physiological control over the nervous system of another through auditory input. When your voice becomes a source of emotional regulation, the person you're speaking to begins to crave more than just your words. They begin to crave the neurochemical state that your presence induces in their body. Controlled misalignment is a psychological tactic that leverages tension and resolution to create a powerful emotional feedback loop within the human brain. At the neurochemical level, the brain is designed to respond to uncertainty with heightened attention. When a conversation contains slight, intentional moments of unpredictability, like a pause that lingers too long, a mild disagreement, or a subtle shift in tone, the listener's dopamine system is triggered. Dopamine is not just the molecule of pleasure, it's the molecule of anticipation. The brain becomes hyper-focused on resolving the unknown, seeking the return to alignment, and that return feels rewarding. CIA interrogators and covert communication experts have long used this principle. By introducing small disruptions to rapport, breaking eye contact momentarily, disagreeing gently, or withholding a verbal confirmation, they create a sense of emotional tension. Then, by re-establishing warmth, agreement, or engagement shortly afterward, they create a cycle of relief. This back and forth activates the mesolimbic pathway in the brain, the same circuitry involved in addiction and romantic attraction. The unpredictability of the reward, not the reward itself, is what spikes dopamine the most. That's the same mechanism found in gambling, variable ratio reinforcement, and the early stages of infatuation in romantic dynamics. When someone agrees too quickly, compliments too often, or remains constantly aligned, the brain habituates. It begins to reduce the emotional response to the interaction because there's no variability. But when misalignment is introduced strategically, such as offering a challenging opinion, withdrawing attention briefly, or playfully questioning a belief, it resets the emotional baseline. The other person subconsciously starts seeking reconnection. They want to bring things back into sync. And when that alignment finally returns through a smile, a shared laugh, or a validating statement, the dopamine reward hits harder than if it had never been disrupted. This is why some of the most magnetic communicators use timing and emotional contrast deliberately. They are not always agreeable. They let moments of silence linger. They give the impression that their attention is earned, not given away freely. And as a result, their interactions feel more valuable. The human brain is wired to pursue what is slightly out of reach. When emotional alignment becomes a prize rather than a guarantee, the desire to achieve it intensifies. This isn't manipulation, it's a deep understanding of how emotional tension and reward create craving. Controlled misalignment also keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged. This is the part of the brain responsible for social analysis and emotional regulation. When someone is slightly unsure about where they stand with you, their brain allocates more cognitive resources to the interaction. They become more present, more attentive, and more invested. This is the opposite of emotional complacency. It heightens sensitivity, increases desire for validation, and deepens emotional memory. Over time, these micro moments of tension and release build a psychological imprint. The person begins to associate you with a state of alert engagement, emotional curiosity, and intermittent relief, a neurochemical cocktail that mimics the early stages of falling in love. Rhythmic eye contact is one of the most primal and effective ways to communicate interest, dominance, trust, and sexual intent. The human visual system is hardwired to interpret gaze as a signal of importance, and the brain responds to it through a complex network that includes the fusiform gyrus, the amygdala, and the orbitofrontal cortex. When two people lock eyes, even for a second, a cascade of neurochemical activity is triggered. Oxytocin levels increase, heart rate can become synchronized, and the amygdala assesses both emotional salience and potential threat or connection. But it's not about maintaining constant eye contact. It's about using rhythm, intentionality, and variation to send subconscious signals that align with attraction and emotional synchrony. When eye contact is held too long without fluctuation, it can feel invasive or uncomfortable. When it's too brief or inconsistent, it can register as insecurity or disinterest. But when it's rhythmic, held intentionally for a few beats, broken with purpose, and then re-established, it activates what is known in social neuroscience as gaze entrainment. The brain begins to sync the timing of attention with the other person's gaze. This entrainment builds familiarity, reduces social anxiety, and enhances the perception of mutual understanding. It also creates the sense that time is slowing down during an emotionally charged exchange. CIA officers are trained to use rhythmic eye contact in both interrogation and report building scenarios. By adjusting the timing and intensity of their gaze, they can convey calm control or intentional emotional openness. In romantic or social contexts, this same principle applies. When a man maintains relaxed yet rhythmic eye contact, especially while speaking about something emotionally sincere or reflective, it tells the other person's nervous system that he is present, grounded, and attuned. This causes the other person's mirror neurons to activate, leading them to feel emotionally in sync, often without realizing why. The combination of gaze with facial micro-expressions enhances this effect. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a tiny upward curl of the mouth, or a subtle eyebrow lift during eye contact can dramatically increase the emotional salience of the moment. These micro signals are read instantly by the other person's brain, especially by regions like the superior temporal sulcus, which is involved in decoding facial intent. When done with precision, rhythmic eye contact paired with subtle expression creates an experience of being deeply seen. That sensation activates the ventral striatum, a brain region tied to reward and motivation, and the result is often a desire to prolong or repeat the interaction. In high-stakes communication training, eye contact is taught not just as a confidence tool, but as a neurological trigger. When you learn to regulate the timing of your gaze, you begin to shape the emotional tempo of the interaction. People will start leaning in more, pausing longer before speaking, and mirroring your nonverbal cues. Over time, they begin associating your eyes not only with attention, but with emotional reward. That craving isn't for the content of the conversation. It's for the feeling their nervous system receives every time your eyes meet theirs in the right rhythm. Presence and emotional pacing are among the most underestimated elements of attraction and influence, yet they are deeply rooted in neurobiology. When someone is fully present in a conversation, their brain emits signals of attentiveness that the other person's nervous system can detect immediately. This presence isn't just psychological, it's physiological. It shows up in posture, blink rate, breathing rhythm, and micro-expressions. A regulated nervous system transmits calm energy, and the other person's system begins to mirror it unconsciously. This is co-regulation, a process where two people's autonomic systems begin to sync. The brain detects the other as safe, attuned, and emotionally valuable, which activates oxytocin and serotonin pathways associated with trust, calm, and bonding. Presence also directly impacts the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for focus, empathy, and decision-making. When someone is fully engaged and not distracted by internal dialogue or external stimuli, it creates a unique form of attention that feels rare and intoxicating to the person receiving it. That rarity amplifies perceived value. In a world where attention is constantly fragmented, someone who can remain emotionally still, focused, and non-reactive becomes neurologically magnetic. Their calmness feels like gravity. Their stillness registers as strength. Their quiet attentiveness becomes more arousing than flashy behavior because it allows the other person's nervous system to relax, open, and begin forming attachment. Emotional pacing refers to the subtle art of matching and then guiding the emotional tempo of the conversation. It begins with attunement, reading the energy, tone, and emotional speed of the other person. Is their speech fast or slow? Are they anxious, relaxed, playful, guarded? Matching that initial tempo creates rapport as the brain registers similarity and safety. Once rapport is established, emotional pacing allows for gentle redirection. If the other person is anxious, your calmness begins to slow them down. If they're guarded, your openness begins to invite reciprocation. This is the neuroscience of influence. Through emotional entrainment, operatives trained in interrogation and deep report techniques understand this implicitly. They never rush to conclusions. They never jump in too early. They wait, they observe, they align, and then slowly lead. That pacing triggers a shift in the other person's brain from guardedness to trust. Over time. This builds a kind of emotional dependency, not through force or persuasion, but through alignment and timing. In intimate contexts, this feels like emotional chemistry, but it's really nervous system synchronization driven by mirror neurons and limbic resonance. When someone is deeply present and masters emotional pacing, they override superficial traits like appearance or cleverness. They speak directly to the nervous system. They create a space where the other person can feel more themselves. And that feeling of being accepted, seen, and emotionally regulated is one of the most powerful rewards the human brain can experience. The craving isn't for the conversation or the stories or even the words themselves. It's for the rare internal state the other person induces simply by being emotionally calibrated and neurologically present